There is a kind of poverty that leaves no scar visible to the naked eye. It does not bruise the skin or break the bone in ways that doctors can measure and record. It works instead on the interior, on the part of a person that forms before they have language for what is happening to them, before they understand that the cold pressing against the walls of a house is not normal, that the hunger sitting in the belly most evenings is not something everyone endures, that wearing your older brother's shirt to school because you have no shirt of your own is not simply the way the world works. It is the kind of poverty that teaches a child, before that child knows anything else, exactly what it means to be invisible. And it was precisely this kind of poverty, grinding, relentless, without apology or relief, that produced the most recognizable face in global cinema. Not despite everything it took from him, because of it. He was the 11th child. Let that number sit for a moment. 11. In a household that was already crowded past the point of comfort, already strained past the point where any individual child could claim space or privacy or more than the barest fraction of parental attention, he arrived 11th. With 4 more children still to come after him, in a house in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, that was never designed to hold what life kept filling it with. He was born Charles Dennis Bukinski on November 3, 1921, to Mary and Walter Bukinski, Lithuanian immigrants who had crossed an ocean not in search of the American dream in its romantic definition, but in search of something simpler and more urgent: survival. They found work in Ehrenfeld. They found the coal industry, which in that corner of Pennsylvania in the early 20th century was not an industry so much as an atmosphere, the thing the town breathed, the thing the men descended into every morning and climbed back out of every evening, covered in black dust, carrying in their lungs the fine particulate evidence of a life spent underground. What the coal mine gave, it gave narrowly. What it took broadly. The Bukinski household was not a place of abundance in any conventional sense, but it was not without its own particular warmth, the warmth of bodies in proximity, of a language spoken at home that was not the language of the streets, of the specific solidarity that large families develop when the outside world offers very little, and the interior world of the household becomes, by necessity, everything. Mary Bukinski kept the family together, with the kind of endurance that history rarely names, but always depends upon. She cooked with what was available. She stretched resources past the point where stretching seemed possible. She raised 15 children in conditions that would have defeated anyone without her particular brand of quiet, implacable strength. Charles watched her. He watched everything, from the 11th position in a household, where watching was often the only available form of participation. And something in that watching, that long, patient, unblinking observation of a world that offered very little and demanded everything, would one day become the most powerful instrument in his professional arsenal. But that was not yet visible, not even close. And then the darkness arrived earlier than anyone should have had to face it. Walter Bukinski died when Charles was 10 years old. 10 years old, the age at which most children are still primarily concerned with the texture of the world as a place of exploration, of small discoveries, of the slow accumulation of understanding about how things work. Charles Bukinski at 10 was abruptly required to understand something else entirely, that the scaffolding holding a family upright could disappear without warning, and that what came after was not grief in the organized sense, but the immediate pressing arithmetic of survival. Who works? What is sold? How the family moves forward through a Pennsylvania winter without the man who had been its economic center. He was 10 years old, and the world was already teaching him its harshest lesson, with no preamble and no apology. He absorbed it the way he would absorb everything that followed, without visible collapse, without the dramatic expression of what it cost him, with a stillness that could be mistaken for acceptance, but was in truth something harder and more active than acceptance. It was refusal, a refusal to be undone by what had been done to him, a refusal so fundamental it did not yet have words, only the shape of a boy standing straighter than circumstances warranted. But no one on the outside could see what that refusal was costing him. The mine came for him in his teenage years, as it came for most young men in Ehrenfeld who lacked other options and could not afford to wait for options to present themselves. He went underground as a car loader, one of the harder physical assignments in the mine's hierarchy of difficult work, moving coal through narrow passages in conditions of near-total darkness, breathing air that carried the fine black particulate of the coal face into the lungs with every breath. The tunnels were low, the space pressed in from every direction. The silence underground was a different kind of silence than any silence available on the surface. Heavier, more absolute, charged with the awareness of how much Earth existed above and around and below, indifferent to the human beings moving through its interior. He worked those tunnels wearing the same shirt his older brother had worn before him. In some accounts of this period, he wore his brother's clothing not as a hand-me-down in the casual sense, but as a literal necessity. There was no alternative clothing available in the household. The boots on his feet were the boots the family owned in his size, shared as the need arose. Some mornings, in the particular cold of a Pennsylvania winter, before the sun had climbed high enough to matter, this was the whole inventory of what Charles Buczynski had to bring to the day. He brought it anyway. He descended into the earth every morning and came back out every evening and said very little about any of it. This was not stoicism performed for an audience. There was no audience. This was the private practice of endurance, in a context where endurance was not admirable or noteworthy. It was simply the minimum requirement for continuing to exist. He met that requirement day after day with a consistency that had no name yet, because in Ehrenfeld in the late 1930s, what Charles Buczynski was doing was not remarkable. It was simply what the 11th child of a widowed Lithuanian immigrant woman did in order to help keep 15 people alive. What no one could have predicted, what Charles himself could not have predicted, because prediction requires a vision of possible futures, and his possible futures were extraordinarily narrow at that point, was that the darkness he was living inside was simultaneously building something, the compression of it, the weight, the long grinding practice of surviving without complaint, of moving through confined spaces with the specific physical economy of someone who has learned that unnecessary movement costs energy that cannot be replaced. All of it was accumulating in his body and his face and his eyes in ways that would not find their expression for decades, but that would, when they finally found it, be absolutely unmistakable. The war arrived and changed the arithmetic of everything. He enlisted, and the military machinery that processed young men from small Pennsylvania towns did not find much to distinguish Charles Buczynski from the others arriving in the same cohort, except possibly his physical endurance, which was considerable, and his affect, which was unusual. He was sent to the Pacific Theater and assigned as a tail gunner on a B-29 Superfortress, a position of specific, concentrated danger, alone in a glass bubble at the rear of the aircraft, watching the sky for enemy fighters while the bomber made its runs. He flew more than 25 combat missions. He was awarded the Air Medal. He saw things that the mines, for all their darkness, had not prepared him to see. He came home from the Pacific in the way that men come home from things that cannot be fully left behind, carrying the weight of it in a way that did not manifest as visible damage, but as a deepened quality of stillness. Those who encountered him in the months after his return described someone who was present and functional and capable, but who seemed to have developed an additional layer of interior distance from the ordinary world, as if he had seen enough of what existence could demand that its usual textures, its noise, its social friction, its small negotiations, had become somewhat abstract to him. He used the GI Bill to study. And here, in this small, almost accidentally available doorway that the post-war government opened for returning veterans, the first real deviation from the path that Ehrenfeld had laid out for him became possible. He studied art, painting specifically, and this fact, sitting quietly in the biographical record, rarely emphasized, easily overlooked in accounts that prefer the action sequences and the box office numbers, is one of the most revealing things about Charles Buczynski that any document preserves. The young man who had spent his adolescence in the dark, who had learned early that the world offered very little and demanded everything, chose, when given the first real freedom of his life, to learn how to make beautiful things. Not practical things, not marketable things in the conventional sense. Beautiful things, paintings, images made from color and light, and the translation of interior experience into something visible. He was, underneath everything the world had made of him, an artist. This would remain true for the rest of his life, in a private studio that very few people ever entered, in work that he never used for publicity or professional advancement. But the impulse was there from the beginning, surfacing the moment the pressure lifted enough to let it through. Acting arrived not as a revelation, but as a practical extension of his art studies, a way to stay engaged with the creative world, while the larger question of what his life would become remained open. He began with the Pasadena Playhouse. He took what work came. He was not charismatic in the way that acting teachers typically meant by the word. He did not project outward with the kind of energetic performed warmth that the theatrical tradition trained actors to deliver. He was quieter, more interior. He listened more than he spoke, on stage as off it. He had very little interest in the social machinery of the entertainment world, its parties and its politics, and its elaborate rituals of professional relationship building. What he had, instead, was the thing that cannot be trained into a person, the thing that the mines and the war and the long practice of surviving in compressed darkness had given him without asking his permission. He had presence, real, physical, psychological presence, the kind that a camera recognizes before the audience does, that directors feel before they can articulate it, that fills the space around a person, even when that person is doing nothing visible. He changed his name to Bronson in 1954. The name Buczynski, in the particular climate of 1950s America, carried associations that were not neutral. The Cold War was producing a cultural anxiety about Eastern European identity that made a Lithuanian surname a professional liability in Hollywood in ways that had nothing to do with talent or craft. The name change was practical, but it was also a kind of threshold crossing, the final formal separation between the 11th child of Ehrenfeld and the figure that the world was about to encounter. The early roles were supporting work, ensemble pieces, character parts, the kind of acting that builds craft without building recognition. He appeared in films alongside established stars and held his own with the particular, understated quality that distinguished his work from the beginning. He was always the most still person in the frame, and the camera was always drawn to him because of it. Directors who worked with him in this period would later describe a quality that resisted easy description, a magnetic weight, a sense that something significant was contained in the silence he brought to every scene. In 1960, he appeared in The Magnificent Seven, and something in the industry's awareness of him shifted, not dramatically, not overnight, but perceptibly. He was not the lead. He was one element of an ensemble. But audiences who saw the film remembered him, often without being able to say precisely why, in the way that you remember the presence of something heavy without necessarily remembering its specific shape. The decade that followed was the slow, grinding ascent of a man who did not perform ambition, but simply showed up, consistently and with total professional commitment, to every piece of work that came his way. He worked in television. He worked in European co-productions. He worked in westerns and crime films, and the kind of mid-budget genre pictures that the major studios produced in volume and that the public consumed without much critical attention. He was not celebrated. He was not a household name in the United States in any sustained way. But something extraordinary was happening in the rest of the world. In France, audiences discovered him with a ferocity that Hollywood did not initially know how to process. In Italy, his films were events. In Japan, where a particular strain of working-class cinema had already cultivated an audience hungry for protagonists who looked like they had actually survived something, Charles Bronson's face was not merely recognizable, it was iconic. By the early 1970s, the box office returns coming in from international markets had produced a fact that the American entertainment industry found genuinely difficult to absorb. In certain global markets, Charles Bronson was the highest paid and most commercially successful actor alive. Not one of the most successful, the most? He received this information with the equanimity of a man who had spent his formative years learning that the world's judgments, of worth, of value, of what a person deserved, were not to be trusted in either direction. The fame did not transform him the way fame transforms most people who arrive at it from a position of hunger. He did not expand into it. He did not perform it. He accepted the professional consequences, better projects, more money, access to the kinds of creative collaborations that had not been available earlier, while remaining in his private life almost aggressively unchanged. The Vermont farmhouse, the painting studio. The family gathered around him with a closeness that had nothing to do with celebrity and everything to do with the fundamental understanding, built in Ehrenfeld, that the only things worth protecting were the people beside you. What the world called his image, the dangerous face, the cold eyes, the physical authority that made audiences instinctively believe he could do what the script required him to do, was not a performance. It was the residue of a real life. Every line in that face had been earned. Every quality of stillness in those eyes had been cultivated in conditions that Hollywood, for all its ability to simulate experience, could not have manufactured. You cannot act your way into looking like someone who has survived what Charles Bronson survived. You can only survive it, and let it mark you, and trust that what is left afterward will be enough. It was more than enough. When Death Wish arrived in 1974 and made him a domestic American phenomenon to match his international status, the cultural conversation around him focused almost entirely on the character he played and what that character represented. The ordinary man pushed past his limits, the citizen who refuses to accept the terms that violence has imposed on his life, the vigilante archetype that both thrilled and troubled the American public of the 1970s. The film generated enormous debate. Bronson himself generated almost none, because he declined to generate it. He did not give interviews that fed the controversy. He did not position himself in relation to the politics of the story. He made the film, delivered the performance, and returned to Vermont. He was not the character. He had never been any of the characters. The characters were the vehicle through which the world had access to a face that communicated without words, something the audiences of 3 continents desperately needed to see communicated, the face of someone who had already been through the worst and was still standing. That was the real performance, the one he never stopped giving, in every frame of every film, across 5 decades of work. Not the action sequences, or the gunfights, or the iconic silhouettes against urban nightscapes. The face of the 11th child of Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, who had gone into the earth as a teenager and come back out of it, carrying something that no amount of darkness could extinguish. Late in his life, when asked in one of the rare interviews he consented to give about his early years, he said very little. He did not romanticize what the mines had taken from him. He did not sentimentalize the poverty or the loss of his father or the brutal physical economy of a childhood spent in service of simple survival. He simply acknowledged it, with the particular directness of someone who has never needed to dress experience up in order to face it, and moved on to the next question. But those who listened carefully noted something in the way he spoke about Ehrenfeld. Not nostalgia, not bitterness, something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. A recognition, perhaps, that the darkness had not only damaged him, that the compression of those years had created, in addition to everything it had cost, a density of character that lighter circumstances could never have produced. That the 11th child, who had worn his brother's shirt to school and descended into the earth before his body had fully formed, had become, through the specific alchemy of survival, something that the world found irreplaceable. He died on August 30th, 2003. He was 81 years old. What he left behind is not simply a filmography, though the filmography is substantial and stretches across more than 5 decades of consistent, serious professional work. What he left behind is an image, specific, irreducible, unlike anything else that cinema has produced before or since, that continues to communicate across time and distance the thing it always communicated when it was alive. That a human being can come from nothing, from the 11th position in a household that had very little to offer, from a coal mine and a war, and a world that assigned him a very particular and very limited set of possible futures, and refuse, quietly, completely, without drama or announcement, to accept any of them. He was the 11th of 15 children. He wore his brother's shirt. He breathed coal dust in tunnels where the ceiling pressed down and the darkness was absolute. And he became, through nothing but the specific gravity of his own endurance, the most recognized face in global cinema. The mine made him invisible. The world made him unforgettable. And somewhere between those two facts lives the whole extraordinary truth of Charles Bronson.